so essentially, Francine and I founded WePlan 2 years ago. We do supply software solutions for long-term manpower planning. We started with crew, and we told you already in our session on Monday that we've evolved this. Now, why is that relevant? What are we talking about today? So today we would like to talk to you about the observations that we've made in the past 1.5 years on how manpower planning has significantly changed, how in times of the pandemic and also in the, let's say, revamp after the pandemic, our clients we've been observing a lot of challenges with our clients and other airlines. And one of the trickiest things were becoming faster at planning and becoming, keeping up with the speed of decision making. So that's essentially what drives manpower planning today. So very volatile demands, and if we want to go to the next slide. Yeah, very volatile demands and jumping actual costs are driving the need for flexibility and speed in decision making. So these jumping actual costs come from intransparency as to what does it actually cost me to fly a certain leg. So our perception is that, not only the avoidance of losses and costs at any time, but also understanding actual cost of legs has become significantly more important. Another issue that was popping up is obviously opening new routes, or the opening of new routes in a very short notice, and then assessing the profitability, the actual profitability again of those routes, to then spontaneously close them if they're not booked out. So this is also something that's been increasingly challenging, or that's, let's say, different from how manpower planning had to work earlier because of the less lead times. Obviously, we see fleet changes. We also have one fundamental change in manpower planning. Old data or historic data cannot be fetched anymore. So you cannot use that very well for assumptions. So those are one of the, just a selection of challenges that we have in manpower planning. At the same time, though, manpower planners had to answer a lot of questions in a very, very short time. So because of that volatile demand, the questions addressed to manpower planning were, for example, is there enough crew to cover a certain version of the flight schedule? What is actually the demand of flight schedule version 101 versus 102? So how do we assess that in no time, and how do we create a solid plan and an assessment of a certain flight schedule in a couple of in just days or minutes? So those were the challenges. And then following those assessments, obviously, how do I then reactivate my crew? If that crew is actually available because they're not locked up in either any quarantine situation, or either they're sick or not trained, how much is it to actually activate them? And what is the actual cost of certain ramp up scenarios? And on top of that, obviously, many of the airlines renegotiated their union agreements, so they also had to look at the effect of certain changes to union roles on the costs and also on the productivity, and whether it helped in a certain scenario of revamping the operations. So that was kind of like the chaos that was going on in manpower planning, and still is. And one of the things that we've observed is that this traditional approach to manpower planning, which was characterized by a long lead times and a structured and, let's say, a rather rigid update process, which took you months, where you would do recruiting, where you do staffing plans, where you would do pairings and talk about a master week and do a training plan and talk to training. That's not happening anymore. There's very little time to look at crew demands when it comes to vacation planning. Like, there's no big discussions on bidding anymore. And so, a lot of that has been actually moved together into a very, very small part of a small fraction of time only. So what we've seen is that all those milestones of the plan have been pushed together, and the whole process has been pushed together, revealing a lot of process and system, let's say, pitfalls or shortfalls. Yeah, it's become very hard to plan with what many airlines have in Excel in such a short notice, because you actually only have 1 to 4 weeks of, let's say, duration of what is the new reality, and then there's a new reality that then has to be assessed. So obviously, if you look at this, the classic, planning process of manpower planning, one of the issues was there was very little transparency on crew availability throughout, especially in the beginning of COVID and also throughout, because they were, on reduced hours, furloughs, sick, quarantine. So that was one issue that needed to be solved. There was, the issue that was always there between training and manpower planning, that a lot of airlines don't have an interface there, became even more critical during the pandemic, because it was really hard to manage this training complexity and together with managing a volatile flight schedule. So that was a big thing. And then that lack of integration between those two planning teams also resulted in a lot of licenses being expired, and the assessment of how much is it to keep that the crew legal, so to say, was a lot of effort and a lot of manual planning. So those were just, like, let's say, the planning things that didn't go as they were before, didn't work anymore the way they worked before. But on top of that, obviously, it was becoming increasingly important to be able to do leg-based costing, and look at what-if scenarios within a very short time frame. So there was no more pairing approach that could be fetched, where you could use the pairing data, because it was just too time-consuming oftentimes to assess a whole flight schedule for a month. Run the pairings, run the roster, and then be able to say how many crew you need. So that time isn't there anymore. And even looking at a much shorter time frame, looking at, let's say, real-time need to assess impact of schedule changes on crew demand, that's even making it even harder. And so, let's say, this whole process has been moved together, and that was actually when we decided we needed to supply a, let's say, solution to our clients that enabled them to increase the pace of decision making in manpower planning. So essentially, what we developed is the roster cost estimator, which is something that is not necessarily replacing manpower planning as such, or let's say, the classic way of doing manpower planning, but it rather helps manpower planning to integrate all considerations that are to be and effects in a quick but not necessarily dirty way. So what happens today is that multiple versions of flight schedules are being pushed to manpower planning, or let's say crew planning, and there needs to be a continuous assessment in very short time frames on that SSIM file. And what you would do now in our tool is now obviously upload that SSIM file. Francie will show you that later. And get an immediate assessment of the demand and the costs, the crew demand and the costs associated with that flight schedule version. And one other thing that we've observed in manpower planning, or one new thing, is that in the past, you've always planned on a master week, so a peak week, for example. But today, you are more looking at a date-specific planning approach. So you are to calculate next month's a crew establishment based on a certain, flight schedule that goes from the 1st to the 31st. So that's rather a different way of looking at manpower planning. Now, when we developed this tool, we also reflected, obviously, together with our clients who bought it, which KPIs are most relevant for manpower planners at such short notice. So what our tool does, it does calculate, it assesses, so to say, the flight schedule that you throw into the tool. It uses the 40 to 50 most relevant pairing and rostering rules. And what it does, it gives you number of duty days, it gives you number of FTE, crew productivity, such as block hours, it gives you the HOTAG and transportation costs associated with the flight schedule, expenses on like catering or other expenses, deadheading, training and training effects and training costs, as well as, so to say, when you then take it back into your manpower planning module, we also show you that one, it gives you the actual cost of crew supply. So how much will it be to supply this flight schedule? And this has several use cases which we will go through. It enables not only the immediate answer to upper management of reducing certain flights or changing certain flight schedule to reduce loss or to avoid losses, but also obviously has that nice effect of being able to say how much more can I sell and at what cost do I have to sell in order to be profitable. And with that, I would like to hand it over to Francie, who's going to fill you in on how the Manpower Planning team can be kind of like helped to accomplish that challenge. And obviously, it's a roster cost estimator that does it for you.
Yes, so as you said, we have used the last month to extensively develop that module because it exactly tackles the challenge of today's volatility. And yeah, so I will use the time today to show you a bit more and deep dive into the complexity of it and also what we have achieved and how the roster cost estimator helps you to answer all those questions that arose. Yes, so first of all, I would like to look at the use cases that from our perspective, like where from our perspective, the roster cost estimator can add a lot of value to your crew planning department. And yeah, so the first one is for sure assessing flight schedule changes. So understanding how much crew do I need when you get a flight schedule, how much does it cost, and how did it change compared to the version before. That really helps you to analyze cost-intensive pairings, but also to do a lag-based costing. And yeah, in addition, what was also very important for us and is not only relevant today in the pandemic, but what was always a discussion before is that it also facilitates the discussion and communication with your network planning. So you can go back to network planning and discuss how you could optimize your network to reduce and to optimize crew costs. So that helps you a lot. And for sure, currently in the moment, it also is a great tool to assess how you can actually manage your ramp up and how much crew you need at what point of time. The second use case where the roster cost estimator supports the crew planning team is the crew negotiation, because as you can simulate the impact of individual rules for pairing and rostering, it is a nice tool that helps you to understand the impact, but also the cost of new crew agreements. So, for example, what you could do is that you also calculate the cost of your company specific rule set, and you can compare it to the legal minimum. So you could really go back then to your unions and your staff representatives to have a data-based decision and a data-based also discussion of what could be done and how you could actually go through the crisis, or in the future of what you can offer to your crew members. And the third use case is then also more on the strategic side of it. So it can also help you to support strategic decisions. So for example, if you think of or if you evaluate to open or close certain bases, for sure that's also something that you could then do in the system, so you can compare the productivity levels. And also currently in the time of the ramp up, that's yeah, for sure also a useful tool when you want to understand at what point of time you want to open certain bases and at what level, and also at what speed you want to open those bases. So those are the use cases where we, from our perspective, believe it's adding a lot of value to the crew planning team. So talking about the approach now, the whole methodology is really based on our belief that the whole planning process has completely changed in the last month. So compared or like currently, you get a new flight schedule and then you have to be very, very quick in assessing how much does it actually cost, how much crew do I need, and what do I need to do. So the classic lengthy and rather holistic planning approach has completely changed. So previously you had the time to, as Lana said before, to pair the flights and to get a better understanding of how much crew you need, and then you could start doing the decisions and start steering the different departments in the company. And now it's more about the question, how do we get a preferably good estimation without running a full roster and pairing optimization? So it's completely different, and the focus is more on time and not on the accuracy of the last numbers, I would say. Yeah, in order to do this, we use a three-step approach in our module. We do have the input, we have the processing, and we have the output. And I would quickly like to go through those 3 steps here. So for the input, we do upload the flight schedules as an SSIM file. You can then select the time frame and the scope. So what do you actually want to want to look at, what period you want to look at, and so on. And then you can select the rule sets. And yes, that's in order to give you a better understanding of how this looks like. Let's take a look into the system. So as I said, you can upload the flight schedule. You can then also decide to just upload parts of it. So for example, currently we are in the situation where we still have border closures. So you probably just want to put in parts of your network and not do a full estimation run. Afterwards, what you can see here now, so that's the rule configuration. At the top, you can see the different runs. And yeah, below you can then see that you are, as a user, you can then really define the scope as said before, but you can also define rule sets. So we do have standard rule sets in the system. So you could, for example, pick EASA or the FAA rules. And but there's for sure also the opportunity to set up a company-specific rule set. So we can really reflect the current rules that you have. And in the use case of having to support a crew negotiation, that's also where you could set up new templates, for example, when you want to manipulate the parameters of the agreement. So for example, all the parameters that you have here can be configured. You can switch rules off and on and so on. So that's the input, first of all. And so what types of rules can be set up in the estimator? We do have all, like the common rules are already set up in the system. So we have block hours per month, per year, duty time, number of days off, also layover days. So all those rules, yeah, in the system, there's a bunch of things you can pick from. But for sure, we know that all the airlines are different, and every time there's a new customer, we are adding more rules to the system because, yeah, as I said, everybody is a bit different. Yes, so then looking at the processing, there's this two-step approach. And so what does it mean having this two-step approach? First of all, the first step is the assessment of the pairing rules, and the second step is then the assessment of the rostering rules. For the pairing rules, we use, as a solution approach, we use a lightweight pairing optimization. So we use a scalable column generation optimization framework, as it's the most flexible one to be adjusted to the individual airline networks. And what we do then, and that's meant by a lightweight pairing optimization, is that we only consider the most important rules which have the largest impact on the FTE numbers. So those would normally be flight duty periods, augmented crew rules, layover times, and so on. Here, I would also like to say that for sure, because we don't cover all the rules that you probably have, this means that those generated pairings could probably not be used for subsequent planning. So for example, there will be always minor changes that you have to do afterwards to the pairings because you have fatigue rules that come on top of it, for example. But nevertheless, the accuracy of the KPIs is very, very close to reality. So it helps you to assess, first of all, what needs to be done from a manpower planning point of view. Yes, so then we add further cost considerations on top, and that's then all put into our optimization run. And then the second step, that's on the rostering side, that's a statistical rule evaluation by a rolling horizon method, and I will explain you also what that means. So we look at the different rostering rules, and then we slice through the flight schedule, and we evaluate the impact, the FTE impact of each individual rule, first of all. So we would look, for example, at duty hours in a consecutive period of time, or we would look at off days and so on. So that's the first thing that we do, and that's first of all to understand what is also the most restricting rule that hits certain periods. So are you rather restricted by block hours, by duty days, or are there potentially other rules that have to be considered? And the second step is then that we anticipate also additional FTE requirements that are caused by potential inefficiencies in the rosters when combining the different pairings to then final rosters. So those would be rules such as rest times at home base, but also block of days off that need to be given to the crew. So just an example to illustrate what we mean. So we have here week 1, those are 2 pairings, a very small example, but still I hope that helps to understand a bit better what we do. So the rule that we evaluate here is that we have to give a minimum of 4 off days after a pairing block length that is greater than 4 days. So now when slicing through the pairing data, what we do is then, or what we can see when now combining those pairings is that when now applying the different rules, we can see that in that case, we have to give one additional off day because they don't fit perfectly together. And this is what is done for all the different rules. And then the system anticipates the total level of inefficiency that can be found in the rosters when applying those rules. Yes, another thing that we would like to point out is that to be airline business model agnostic, we also need to have different focuses that are set within the solution assessment. So just two examples here. On the left side, we have a cargo airline, and the business model is a single base, a single fleet, long haul operation, and in combination with a hub and spoke like network with many decentralized connections. And yeah, for that airline, the FTE number is really rather driven by the pairing rules that we have in the agreement. So the focus is also on the pairing side. And as mentioned here, the FTE number is really driven by, for example, the flights that have augmented cockpit crews or by the number of layover days that need to be given. On the other hand, on the right side, we have an example of a European charter carrier, and the business model is a multi-base single fleet. It's a short-haul operation, and the operation is operated as a multiple separate hub and spoke network. So in summary, we have no or just a very few layover nights. Pairing is not very complex, so the focus is rather on the roster side. And the FTE number is mainly driven by rostering rules, such as off-day rules, as well as possible connections of the pairings. So there's always a different focus depending on the business model that the airline has. We would set the focus on the part of the rules that really drive the FTE number. Now looking at the output, what do you get? So by standard, there's a KPI report and also some dashboards that display the KPIs on crew productivity and also crew cost. You could also export the data. And then once you have decided that this is really the flight schedule you want to go with in future, that can be also pushed in your manpower plan to then compare your demand and also your supply, and can also be pushed into other crew planning teams to follow with subsequent planning activities. So to show you some examples, so here on the right side, you can see an exemplary KPI report for one of the estimation runs. And it displays, as I mentioned, the different KPIs on productivity, so block hours, duty days, block hours per duty day, but also other information such as hotel nights or deadhead requirements. And it also gives us the total cost of delivery of the flight schedule. So you would also see a breakdown of also the variable cost components of your flight schedule. Then there's another view here. So we also have gun views in there. So if you're really interested in all the details, you can also look into the produced pairings, understand a bit better how those are put together. And also that helps to identify whether there are additional rules that you probably want to reflect in the system, because some pairings don't reflect what you would do later on in your operation. And then once you're done with the evaluation and the creation of the different estimator runs, then you can push it into the manpower plan to then actively manage your crew supply. So here you would then add on top all the different components that come on top. So for example, reserve assumptions, training assumptions, and so on. You would then compare it to the crew qualifications and the crew contracts that you have in the system. And then you can really start on managing and steering the different teams in your crew planning departments, and for example, decide to activate crew members, start recruiting activities, or even decide to change the profile of the training activities. So that's that. And last but not least, on the left side, you can see our latest client we are very happy about. So so what are the arguments and what are also the convincing factors of using such a solution? So first of all, it really gives you great transparency on the rules and also the cost per route. Then it has a very high performance, so we get results in only minutes and not hours. And yeah, that is mainly achieved because we have this 80-20 approach in the system. So we focus on the most important rules, knowing that for sure until the day of operation, there might be changes. But I mean, that happens all the time that we have to change the plan currently. So it really helps, first of all, on the manpower planning side to start the activities that need to be done. And the last point here is a continuous learning. So we also analyze historic roster performance to avoid the very costly pairings and also avoid to plan pairings where we already know that normally they fall apart in the operation. So we improve the quality of the estimation every time we get a monthly update of the actual pairings. We are able to then look back and understand what happened and do we want to change and improve the quality of the estimation. Yes, so that's it. Thank you very much for listening, and we are now here for questions. We hope you liked it, and yes, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for the insights. We already got quite a bunch of questions. The first, I'm starting in the sequence they were raised, and if we remember the day one where Marcel introduced the questions being brought up by the airlines and where we made a little representative survey, question then is, what could be, from your opinion, be the reason why so many big airlines are using Excel for manpower planning and not sophisticated tools, including optimizers? Or in other words, how do you want to convince people to rely on your magic?
Yeah, thank you. I'll start, and Francie, please jump in. So I think, you know, also from our previous lives as consultants, I think it's a pretty hard, one of the things is probably it's a pretty hard case to argue against Excel costs, like just from the implementation costs, because Excel is there anyways. And if you have somebody who's really good at Excel and very analytic and also knows crew management, then you can, you know, do capacity planning, manpower planning in Excel. Though we do observe that in the recent, let's say, 5 years, the questions that were being asked to the manpower planning team drive them to the, let's say, capability edge of Excel. So a lot of those scenario comparison things that we've now created are not impossible, but yeah, almost impossible to create in Excel. Formulas are getting very, very complicated. It's really hard for others to understand what, you know, what that person who's been probably building the Excel for the past 25 years and running it has actually done, and how to change it. So I think that's going to be one of the reasons why they should go for our solution, because it does bring transparency on what is happening and why data has changed. But yeah, I mean, it's there anyways. So that's why many airlines are still on Excel. And the second thing is that I think that manpower planning is just, there's a bigger business case with optimization and pairing in the past and rostering, because that cannot be done in another tool, and it's very obviously a very big lever for efficiency improvement and optimization. So that's why many airlines have focused on getting that sorted out and investing in that kind of like area of planning instead of doing the Excel one. But I think many of them are struggling to see that, you know, they've reached what they want to reach also with reporting and analytics when it comes to using Excel as a solution.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. We then have a question. I think you answered it partially, but just to be clear, do you create pairings faster to get duty days or some other methods to estimate?
Yeah, I mean, probably Sebastian can also jump in, but we have this two-step approach. So we first of all generate pairings. So there's that optimization of pairings before, and then based on the pairings, we have a statistical assessment to then derive the number of FTE, considering all the roster rules. So we do have optimization on one side, but then followed by a more statistical assessment of the FTEs that are required.
Okay. I hope this answers Uri's question. We then have the question, the paycheck at the end of the month, is the crew depending on the crew contract? Oh, hold on. Is that variable also considered while selecting manpower? So
you mean variable crew cost, or?
What variable crew costs and maybe also different contractual models?
You can if you're how do you call this, union, or like if you can, like we have clients that are not allowed to do that, but the system is capable of doing it. Let's put it like that.
Okay. Then the question, which pairing and rostering optimizers do you use for estimating pairings and rosters, and what's their efficiency in comparison to the leading optimizers from Jeppesen and Adopt on a scale 1 to 10?
Well, I think this
11 is not an adequate answer.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, Sebastian, can you hear us, and would you like to answer that question?
Yes. Hello.
Hi, Sebastian. Sebastian, for everybody, Sebastian is the person behind the optimization, so he's the guy who created it.
Yeah. So let's say from the point we have not a full-blown pairing and roster optimizer. Yeah, it's as it says stated in the presentation, it's some kind of lightweight engine. Yeah, because we do not have to consider all the rules in 100% detail. That's just for the estimation. So, but from the optimization point of view, we are using state-of-the-art optimization approaches and commercial tools which are available. And yeah, as I think maybe Franzi or Lana can give you also some information about our collaborations.
Yeah, and I mean, with regards to the runtime, so when we put it now into the system as it's a really lightweight optimization, first of all, we currently have runtimes around 5 minutes for a period of a month, or yeah, so that's currently the range we're talking about. And I mean, obviously, depending on the detail you want, the more rules you put in, that would also increase, but that's currently the range we're talking about.
Yeah, but like you're talking about the let's say the closeness, how close are we to the established ones? We are not here to replace the established pairing optimization or, you know, solutions or rostering. Like that whole world is going to stay where it is, and it's going to be excellent. What we try to solve is the issue of getting an answer in minutes, and that's why obviously we consider the most important rules to reduce the number of the runtime, but also to focus on what's really relevant. And currently, our clients that do then pair and roster with established, let's say, solutions that they got from the market, they're at 5%. The difference between our solution, that the result is around 5 to 10%. Currently, depending on obviously how many rules you put in. The more rules you give us, the more precise and accurate it becomes. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Next one. Can you compare scenarios inside the tool, or is it done outside?
No, inside the tool, you have as many as you want. You can run scenarios, you can simulate, and you can also create copies of your initial plan. You know, you have your establishment, and then you throw in a new flight schedule, create a copy, call it, you know, flight schedule of yesterday, and then compare that to the version of the reality of the flight schedule tomorrow, or whatever commercial throws at you. And then Franzi showed you, I think, a couple of graphs on how you can then display also to upper management the difference between the scenarios on the establishment. So when am I, you know, having significant lack of crew, or where am I incurring significant costs? Okay.
I see there are still, so with every question we answer, we get a new one. We have quite a big, and you've been very efficient on your time. So there is definitely interest in this 80-20 approach to manpower planning. Is the cost estimator close enough to give absolute cost guidance, or is it more being supposed to be used to give an indicative magnitude of cost and savings versus a baseline? So would you make your annual budget on it, or is it more to assess profitability?
I mean, it's from what we know from our other clients, how the budgeting was done before, that's obviously much more precise. But yes, I mean, if you compare it then later on to the actual costs, you will for sure have differences, because I mean, it's giving us an estimation, but in the end, on the day of operation, there will happen so many different things. You can use it for budgeting, but you have to be aware for sure that until the day of operation, there happen changes. And but yes, I mean, we also our clients also use it for budgeting, and now it's adding much more components to it than just the fixed cost. You can also now put in a lot of variable factors, and also hand this over to the finance team. And I mean, the other thing is really that we wanted to have the ability to compare different versions of the flight schedule. So for that, from that point of view, it really helps to understand what is costing more or less. So that's also one of the use cases.
Yeah, talking budget, you would obviously that's the primary use case because it increases the pace of decision making. But you can use it for your budget. You just have to add a couple of additional assumptions, and then you can use it for your budget and be just as fast, if not faster, with that.
Okay. Do you report on financials within the tool or outside?
We have financials in the tool.
Okay. Can you give some more details on the column generation approach? I think this is more again for Sebastian then.
Yes.
Though I would love to hear you also on it. So for example, main academical sources, who the subproblem, I think that's how the subproblem is modeled, and how the starting solution is generated. So Sebastian, do you want to draw something at the virtual whiteboard?
The virtual whiteboard, yeah, would be funny to do. But actually, we have, let's say, some strategies to get an initial amount of pairings. I mean, that is really depending on the size of the size and complexity of the network. There's a lot of parallelization, a lot of heuristics. They are generating this initial set, and yeah, then we are optimizing the first thing, and then checking, let's say, if the problem is feasible, or if there are certain flights not covered good, or where could we improve, and yeah, then we go back to the iteration and generate some more pairings. I mean, it's really depending on the customer. We have some customers where we do not need this kind of column generation because it's not that complicated to create all the pairings prior to the optimization. So there is no iterative approach in place for them, and for some we have that kind of iterations. I mean, I think there's a lot of literature available. I think last week was one famous academic presenter who has written a lot of literature about pairing optimization. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, if you want to really have some details, you can come or you can contact us directly. So I think that's nothing to tell here in 5 minutes in all the details.
And Sebastian can really get into detail, so that would really exceed our time.
Okay. The next question, so we're still good on time. So how do you suggest time changes while analyzing the upcoming schedule, for instance, to increase block per trip or block hours per trip day? Or yes. I think prior the how, there would also be the if. So do you also make suggestions how to
so like, yes, we do have analytics on the whole network, so you can look at the network and then identify what are the cost pairings and what are the pairings that are very costly at this currently. So you would, for example, see that if you have a lot of pairings starting on a Monday on a time that from a crew perspective is not a good time, and that would occur a lot of additional costs, you would also see that. So then you can take this, go back to commercial planning and talk about what would be nice to change. I mean, obviously understanding that sometimes you can't change things.
Would this also
one thing? Yeah, but I think there's another use case that's maybe relevant, not only like, the peaks that are created by commercial within the flight schedule that are sometimes not beneficial for crew if every pairing starts at Monday 4 a.m., but also if there's a certain combination of flights that are just where the second flight or the flight that could be matching or fitting into the pairing is starting, I don't know, 10 minutes too early. We also have a report on that. So that's kind of like that inefficiency that would then cause an additional crew. Or a crew swap, that we also have a report on that. And when it comes to wanting to change in the flight, like the flight schedule itself that you throw into the system, you can either change it before you import the SSIM, but you can also manipulate it in the tool if you wanted to, before you then start the run.
Okay. So then there's the question then, so what is behind the scenes? Can you disclose a bit your tech stack?
The tech stack, okay, yeah, Sebastian.
Beside magic.
It's just magic. No, Sebastian, I mean, just a brief overview probably.
And of course, Diego and Tequila.
Yeah, Diego and Tequila.
Yeah, Diego is a massive part of this. Sebastian, you and Diego, do you want to just quickly elaborate?
Yeah, I mean, from the back end, I think we are using, or not, I think we are using a modern Python and web-based tech stack. So we have really, let's say, leveraging all the cloud functions that are available.
Yeah, so it's on a Google Cloud, the platform. Yeah.
Yeah, and we're using let's say modern app structure, Python-based net. Also, I think now I should avoid the word think. So
Okay.
we are, yeah, it's mainly Python and web-based stack.
Okay, so we have 3 more so far. How do you calculate pairing rosterability and wasted days to generate manpower requirements? So I think this goes into this second step you illustrate or you explained. So first trying to find some good pairings and then assessing, okay, where are my efficiency killers?
Yeah, so we simulate how we could combine the different pairings. So we would take the individual rules, then we put the pairings together, and then we slice through the pairings and also through the flight schedule in general to identify how many of those would drive additional costs because you have to give additional off days, or you generate, for example, blank days in the roster. So that's the methodology behind it.
Yeah, so it's anticipating how good is the, let's say, the ability to combine them within a roster. Sebastian, is that anything you want to add?
No, I think it's correct. Actually, it's really mainly having like 10,000 of counters and moving with different time frames over the pairings and really let's say calculating averages, minimums, maximums, counting in and outs and all the things, and adding off days, subtracting off days and all the things, and and just then moving step by step or time by time over this flight plan and really comparing those counters against each others and then identifying this inefficiency. So the same answer as for the pairing optimization. It's so many details. So if you're interested in the details, we could, let's say, schedule a separate session for presenting all those.
Okay. The product has a database or does it work on files or both?
It has a database. So we have a database, and then, as I said, it's a cloud-based solution, and we host it, and you can also host it if you want, and we can also use your infrastructure, but we have a proper database.
Okay. Another one coming in is the crew training recency cost measured while activating the crew? So some transitional costs.
Yeah. So we also have an optimization on the training side, and to also look at the question, at what point of time do you need to activate the crew, how taking into account expiries, but also other factors, career paths, training capabilities, resources, and so on.
Okay. Then the last question so far, but I have one more personal, and it's partly
as well.
Okay, yeah. Then there was the question being brought. Lana, you partially answered it, or the number was a bit slipping through. How accurate is your output when you solve the pairing problem with the approximate rules? And I think we're talking about pairing efficiency or total solution cost. So did you have a chance to do a benchmark there?
Yeah, we ranged between 5%, and that really depends on, as we said, how many rules you put in. We can also get to 98% accuracy or 100% accuracy, but in order to stay with the 80-20 approach, we normally have a range between 5, 6, 7, 8%.
Okay, then Marcel, your question.
Thank you very much. I'll put on my camera as well, so you can see me while I ask it. Yeah. Well, at the beginning, you showed this bulldozer who swept away all the milestones into one short moment in time. My question is, were we stupid before we did this? In other words, shouldn't we have done this way before the pandemic? And once everything will be cleared up, will the bulldozer sweep it back again?
So, to be honest, we started thinking and building this before the pandemic, because we have, as I said, as Francie also elaborated, one of the use cases is being, being a charter carrier or a carrier which is very interested in knowing actual cost of legs and knowing what can be squeezed into, or like ad hoc charter questions being raised by commercial. That's the use cases we started with. And then obviously Corona hit, and then it became just interesting, but that's a different, more interesting to use the tool. I don't think the traditional way of manpower planning will sustain exactly the way it was before, because it was very decentral, not very integrated. So I think the closeness, like we've always, when we worked with airlines in the past 10 years, we were always surprised how little, or how little communication is going on, and manual communication is going on between HR, training, finance, crew planning, flight ops, and we are trying to solve that since we founded WePlan. And I think in the pandemic, especially commercial and crew planning and manpower planning have been, working, and training have been working closer together, and there's more need for their system support also to be integrated. So I think that will significantly change. In the past, we've also seen those days where commercials said this is the flying program. Nobody really cared, to be honest, whether crew planning liked it or not. That was what is to be flown, because that's where we earn the money. But now, where crew is a shortage and where actual cost of delivery is being looked at, that's actually interesting to understand what manpower planning has to say about the flight schedule. And now we are trying to enable them to bring that answer faster to commercial, and not take 4 days to pair something and then another day to roster something, before you then go back to commercial and say the flight schedule is expensive on the Monday, right? So
yeah, okay, well, thank you.
I have one question, because I find I'm a personal big fan of the 80-20 approach. So, but how do you identify those rules which are the most critical ones or the most limiting ones? And
yes, we do an analysis before. So we obviously look at the actual pairings and the rosters of an airline, and we also do this continuously. So we set up an initial assessment, and I mean, normally when you talk to the crew planning department, they exactly know what rules are, right? So we start with this first. We also do a simultaneous analysis of the rosters, and then we have a first set of rules, and then it takes a period of time. So so every month we then look back into past pairing reports to then identify, are there any additional aspects that now kick in and really drive the FTE demand to make it better and better over time.
Yeah, and we have,
but normally they know or not. of it.
Yeah, we have all the, you know, EASA, FAA, we have that basic set in there anyway. So, and then we top up with the, you know, airline specific business or union roles. Yeah.
Cool.